Hi. So good afternoon or morning or evening. I'm Hannah Zevan. I'm the founding editor of Parapraxis Magazine and the co-director with Alex Colston of the Psychosocial Foundation. And today we're hosted by these two new groups, Parapraxis, which is a popular magazine of psychoanalysis on the left, and the Psychosocial Foundation, which has just entered its second year. So I encourage you all to sign up if you're new to us for our mailing list. Which you can access at the bottom of our webpage. You can also, of course, subscribe to Parapraxis. The foundation is starting to run a few short courses, one that started today on Klein, one in April on Winnicott and Bion, and then one that still has seats available in it as well is Laura Shihai's Fanon class, which will be taught over May and June. And subsequent events in this series are on technology, on solidarity, and on property. So stay tuned and please come back. So today we're so honored to have Doctors Ronjaunee Chatterjee and Anahid Nersessian to come together to speak to love in the psychosocial and beyond it. And sadly, Merve Emre is unable to join us last minute. But we will instead dialogue instead of roundtable on love. So Freud's most famous comment on love is actually not about love, but about cure. His pithy adage, quote, love and work, work and love, that's all there is, end quote, is also translated another way. Rather than that's all there is, Freud argues that love and work comprise the totality of humanness. After all, it is to and through this totality that psychoanalysis addresses its patient, and it is also its aim to redress the pain of being alive for production and reproduction, to get on, to continue. So this has been the bedrock of psychoanalysis's normativity and one of its many open flanks for critique. That psychoanalysis is a cure that might restore love is also its method of transference on finding the object lost, now refound as a medium for restoration. Or as Lacan says famously, directly, in the beginning of psychoanalysis was love. Psychoanalysis is a cure through love. But love never appears alone, and it is always in relation, or as Freud argued, it is already part of an economic exchange. And thus, for psychoanalysis, love is always predicated on what came before and how it recirculates in affinitude. There isn't actually, for psychoanalysis, all that much love to go around. Or as Adam Phillips describes the most ordinary sense and case of falling in love, quote, it is as if, oddly, you were waiting for someone, but you didn't know who they were until they arrived. Whether or not you were aware that there was someone missing in your life, you will be when you meet the person you want. What psychoanalysis will add to this love story is the person you fall in love with really is the man or woman of your dreams, that you have dreamed them up before you met them, but not out of nothing. Nothing comes from nothing, but out of prior experience, both real and wished for, end quote. So if love is always out of the past, when it re-arrives, so do its opposites. Love often announces itself under the guises of its twins through its antitheticals, which are, for Freud, he names in Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, being loved, contra love, hatred, contra love, but also indifference. Or Phillips again, all love stories are frustration stories. So today we will turn to love, its economies, its opposites, its subjects, its scales, its objects, its textures. So without further ado, let me get out of the way and introduce our two brilliant panelists who will dialogue with each other on love and then hopefully with the rest of us. So Ronjaunee Chatterjee is an assistant professor of English at Queen's University. Her work broadly engages 19th century literature, feminist and queer theory, critical race theory, and psychoanalysis. She's the author of the new book, Feminine Singularity, The Politics of Subjectivity in 19th Century Literature, that came out at the end of last year from Stanford. And I'll drop the link in the chat. It's phenomenal. And if you're interested in the book, last year, the foundation hosted a roundtable on feminine singularity. So I'd encourage you to check that out. She's also the editor of a forthcoming Norden critical edition of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which I can't wait for. And her work has appeared or is forthcoming in Differences, Mediations, Victorian Studies, the LA Review of Books, and other venues. Anahid Nersessian is a professor of English at UCLA. She's the author of 3 books, most recently Keats' Odes, A Lover's Discourse, which was first published by the University of Chicago Press in 2021 and has a new super gorgeous edition out with Verso just at the end of 2022. Her first academic book, Utopia Limited, Romanticism and Adjustment, was published in 2015 and was followed on by The Calamity Form on Poetry and Social Life in 2020 by Chicago Press. And Anahid also writes regularly for the New York Review of Books, most recently an essay on the couple form, on poetics and form, 2 new books, and I'll get that link too. So our format for today will be to hear Ronjaunee and Anahid each, then in dialogue, and we'll save some time for questions from the audience as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and please, you can take it away, Ronjaunee.
Great, thank you so much, Hannah, for those introductory remarks. And again, thanks as always to Parapraxis and to the Psychosocial Foundation for putting on these events and giving us these opportunities to think together, which sometimes feel rare. So I'm really excited to be talking to Anahid today. I'm going to keep my opening remarks kind of informal and a little brief, and sort of allow things hopefully to emerge as we speak and answer questions. But I'll say a little bit just about how I sort of came to write about love and how I came to sort of think about it. I wrote an essay for this scholarly journal, Differences. It's out now, on love in psychoanalysis, but also in philosophy and in feminist theory, specifically in Black feminist theory, as those sort of 3 fields of inquiry, if we can call them that, form the coordinates of my intellectual foundation, how I think. So in a lot of ways, the essay was, making sense of love, but making sense too of my love for these ways of thinking. So, trying to figure out my relationship to literary and philosophical objects. So that aspect of the personal, I think, is always sort of in play. But the prompt for the issue was on psychoanalysis, or was to think psychoanalysis and solidarity. And I knew I immediately wanted to write about love. I didn't precisely know why, but I had, a couple of phrases that had been rattling around in my head for a long time. And I'll kind of say them in a moment, but they're phrases that to me kind of started to elaborate the possibilities and the potential of love outside of what we might call the amorous couple, or the couple form, or the dyad, or even we could just say the kind of fusional, harmonious idea of love that has, endured since at least Plato. So, I had these 2 phrases. One is by Lacan. It's potentially well known. It's one of his definitions of love as giving what you do not have to someone who doesn't want it. And the other phrase was by philosopher Alain Badiou, who takes a lot from Lacan, though also departs from him in some meaningful ways, that love is minimal communism. So I kind of threaded the essay around these 2 kind of like nodal points, but also moving through a number of other sort of key texts and ideas. So meaningfully trying to kind of bring together not only some idea of love in psychoanalysis, but also some of the kind of important philosophers who have thought about love in and through psychoanalysis. So Jean-Luc Nancy and Badiou. And then, trying to kind of think about what meaningful relations there might be with Black feminist theory, for whom love is quite, or has been quite central. When you think about, very important kind of thinkers like bell hooks, like June Jordan, like the Combahee River Collective. In the piece I write about Beloved, right? Morrison's novel, which is very much a kind of important text for Black feminist theory. So while a lot of these, let's say again, fields of inquiry haven't really been thought through together, I wanted to kind of take up the challenge to do so, right? And in doing so, I made a kind of few, let's say, I hazarded some arguments about love. One is that love is a kind of thinking, in the sense that both share a measure of risk, right? So love has a kind of, boundedness to thought. And it, I think has so for, again, perhaps since Plato, right? As you think about Diotima's speech in the Symposium and this sort of thing. So love is a kind of thinking. Love is sort of tarrying with the incommensurable, right? So what, in many ways cannot be bridged, what is not sameness. So love is a kind of rigorous thinking of difference too, but one that can't sort of be given in advance or scripted in advance. So in that way, what I tried to do is sort of think about the incommensurable, think about difference, while also trying to meaningfully put texts in a kind of relation. So that was the piece, and a lot of it is a spillover from some of my work in the book Hannah mentioned about singularity, because there is too, in my thinking, something about the relationship between love and the singular. Love as an experience or an encounter with what is sort of non-repeatable or unique, right? Everyone in love is reminded of that sort of unrepeatable nature of the encounters. So, it kind of spilled over from there. But I think there was still a lot left to be said. I couldn't sort of fit everybody into the article, and so I restricted myself to some figures. So, again, I'm looking forward to talking more about those figures, those edges. And again, I think what Hannah said at the beginning of this event, that love never appears alone, is incredibly important, right? That it travels not only with negativity, with opposites, with hate, with ambivalence, with these sort of terms that we don't necessarily want to associate them with love, but also that it is fundamentally about a kind of relation. And that relation can not only be sort of romantic desiring, it can also be sort of about thought. It can be sort of philosophical, right? Those things aren't necessarily separate. So maybe I'll stop there. And yeah, Anahid, should we move to you?
Okay, I think I am unmuted. Awesome. Hi, everyone. I just want to echo what Ronjaunee said, thanking Hannah and Alex and everybody who's involved with Parapraxis and with the foundation for setting up events like these, including the one today, because they're really exciting. And, Ronjaunee is exactly right that there are so few opportunities for people to really think in a processual way together. And it's really special to be able to do something like this. So I'm really excited to be here. I'll get started right away. I'm going to warn you all that there is an interactive component to my presentation. So if you want, go ahead and grab a pencil or open a Word document, or just know that you're going to be taking some kind of notes in your head. Or if you're not a person who enjoys participation, don't worry about it. You can just zone out during that part of the talk. But don't worry, no one will have to share their answers to any question. I'm not collecting papers or asking people to share answers, although that's something that we might want to do in the discussion that follows. So the first part of the talk is very, very short. And it's essentially, a sort of, I guess I could call it a free write. It's a sort of vomiting forth of my own id in response to being asked to give a presentation today. So I'll do that, and then I'll move into the more interactive portion of the thing. Okay. I don't really have anything to say about love. Psychoanalysis and I have that in common. Most of the time when people talk about love, they're talking about its referred pain, desire, for example, obsession, aggression. And when psychoanalysts talk about love, usually they're talking about babies. Good breast this, bad breast that. I seriously don't want to hear about anyone's mother ever again. Not everything is a catastrophe, including children. 2 nights ago, my toddler's diaper failed during dinner and leaked shit everywhere. It was annoying and hilarious. I think love is basically that, annoying and hilarious. Here are a couple of other things I believe. I believe that love means careful attention, which is not the same as undivided attention. Eve Sedgwick taught us that. If you love someone, set them free from your merciless supervision. I believe that love means reciprocity, which means that if you give something you don't have to someone who doesn't want it, don't expect a medal. I believe that love's exhaustion in the category of the erotic is itself exhausting. I believe that people who say teaching is erotic or that being a student is erotic really need to get out more. I believe that lots of people are bad at being people. When my friend Lauren got married nearly 10 years ago, she asked me to read something at her wedding. I read a portion from Alejandro Jodorowsky's book on the tarot, a section describing what the lover's card would say if it could speak. It would say, Jodorowsky says, I free you to live your own life. This is where love agrees with communism. When my teacher, Lauren, not the same Lauren, was dying, I did a tarot reading for them. I used the tarot of the Cat People deck because I thought they'd like that. Sometimes I'll be searching through my text messages to find some information that I need to complete some irrelevant task, and I'll pull up old texts from Lauren by accident. I'm struck by how banal they are, which is also what makes them painful. They say things like, I'm on my way. When I first found out that Lauren was sick, I forced myself, and I do mean forced myself, to tell them I loved them because I worried that I would be sorry if I didn't. They took it like I would have expected, which is to say, with a slapstick performance of embarrassment and pleasure. I can count on one finger the number of times I have been glad to hear someone say, I love you. By someone, I mean an adult. I was going to say today that psychoanalysis has a problem, which is that its model for the subject is the child. I think this is why so many people get stuck in treatment, because it is delightful, absorbing, in many ways therapeutic, and in many ways extraordinarily destructive to continue to think of oneself as a child. I propose that at least one of the many reasons why the posture and the narratives of the child hold so much appeal within, in particular, capitalist modernity is because we do not have a common or popular language for describing adults as worthy of care. Even that word, worthy, is a betrayal of care's premise. I propose that another reason people get stuck inside the architecture of the child is because we do not have a communist language for responsibility. Indeed, sometimes I think we use the language of care instead of using the language of responsibility because one sounds nice and the other sounds like a shorthand for the Protestant work ethic. Anyway, we should take care of each other and we should be responsible for ourselves. I hope that's not controversial. So much is lost when we don't make our own language. I thought that here I would give you some love poems and you could see what you think. I thought that here I would give you a list of the dumbest things I've ever heard anyone say about love and you could see what you think. I thought that the zone of intersection between love poems and stupidity would be large, but not as large as you might think. Anyway, pencils ready. This is the interactive portion of the talk. Is everybody ready? Okay, let's see if I can get here. Share screen. Uh-oh, I have to set something up in system preferences. Let's see if this works. It's telling me I might have to quit and reopen Zoom, but let's see if it doesn't. Okay, can you all see that? Give me the thumbs up if you can see
Yes.
that. Okay, Thank you, Alex. Good job. Alex is ready to be interactive. Okay. Question 1. The time to labor for every animal that inhabits Earth is when it is still day, except for those to whom the sun is hateful. But then when heaven sets fire to its stars, some turn for home and some nestle in the woods to find some rest before dawn. True or false? And I may not cease to sigh with the sun from when dawn begins to scatter the shadows from around the earth, waking the animals in every woodland. Yet when I see the flaming of the stars, I go weeping and desire the day. True or false? When the evening drives out daylight's clarity and our shadow makes another's dawn, I gaze pensively at cruel stars that have created me of sentient earth. And I curse the day I saw the sun that makes me in aspect like a wild man of the woods. True or false? I do not think that any creature so harsh grazed the woods, either by night or day, as she, through whom I weep in sun or shade. And I am not wearied by first sleep or dawn, for though I am mortal body of this earth, my fixed desire comes from the stars. True or false? Might I pity in her, might I see pity in her for one day before I return to you, bright stars, or turning back into cherished woodland, leave my body changed to dry earth. It would restore many years and before dawn enrich me at the setting of the sun. True or false? May I be with her when the sun departs and seen by no one but the stars for one sole night, and may there be no dawn. And may she not be changed to green woodland issuing from my arms, as on the day when Apollo pursued her down here on earth. But I will be beneath the wood's dry earth, and daylight will be full of little stars before the sun achieves so sweet a dawn. True or false? So that was question 1. And this is question 2. Please write down or otherwise take note of the following. List 5 people in your life with whom you experience the most conflict. These should be people you know personally, not public figures you have never met. I'll say it again. List 5 people in your life with whom you experience the most conflict. And I'll give everyone a minute. Okay, some people may have guessed what the next question will be. List 5 people in your life for whom you feel the greatest love. And then finally, please make a new list of any names that appear on your first 2 lists. So if they appear on the first list and they appear on the second list, put them both in a new, or put them in a new list. And don't worry, we're not going to share unless, again, people want to volunteer. Okay, third question. This one is multiple choice. Love is A, the commodity form of subjectivity. B, a going out of our own nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, or person not our own. C, a babe, as you know, and when you put your startling hand on my cunt or arm or head, or better, both your hands to hold them in my own, I'm awed and we laugh with questions. Or D, all of the above. And if you choose D, please briefly write a little note to yourself as to why you chose D. And then finally, I have a true or false lightning round. This is a sudden death, true or false. That Freud that you enjoy reading doesn't clarify what I desire. You came here, and I repeat, nothing binds you to me, yet you decide to stay. True or false? It may be I'm not as strong as other women are, who, torn and crushed, are not undone from love. It may be I am colder than the dead, who, being dead, love always. True or false? I live under heavy fear of being enlaced by a desire for someone I cannot have. But I see roses in ice sheets on the roads, clear weather in a sky that's overcast. Birds sing from the snowdrifts. True or false? To be in love is to touch with a lighter hand. In yourself you stretch, you are well. True or false? And then this is the last one. My trousers smell shamelessly of love. I've stopped washing. I swim in the young person's pool face down. Every now and then, my guardian angel tries to pull me out of the water by the hair. Then I lose hair like a dog in November. But even bald-headed, I stay in the water. Often he pumps my head full of air to make me surface, but I fasten my teeth in the weed, for heads are unreliable. Don't hand me a monstrance, I'm forever choking on the host. But hand me eggs and cocoa, for my soul hungers and thirsts after these. So it goes. True or false? And that is it for my presentation.
Thank you. And I will bring back Ron. I love Karina's latest chat, which is just like, we expect citations at the end. Please.
I've got them. I have them for you. Don't, never fear. I have them.
Is there something you want to glean from having, subject tested 100 people on the question?
Yeah, I mean, that's so partly I was thinking about, Ronjaunee and I didn't plan this in advance, although I think there were some really interesting intersections, including the Lacan quote, but there are some interesting overlaps and intersections between what we were both saying. One question would be that if love is a form of thought, which I think is a really plausible account of one of the things that love is, if love is a form of thought, is it in search of truth? Is it a form of thought that seeks after facts, right? And so, one thing that I, think about a lot in my own work is the truth status of poetry or the truth claims of literature. And so I wanted to sort of ask, people to respond in the moment to the truth claims or lack thereof in love poetry. because love always does make a claim on somebody. And to some extent, it makes a claim about the nature of reality, right? So that is meant to be a kind of warm up exercise. But if anybody wants to volunteer, I saw somebody said in the chat that they don't have conflict with anyone. And I've done this exercise before, this question about conflict, and I'm always envious of people who say they have no conflict with anybody. Usually what people discover, and I don't know if it's a discovery, but usually what people discover is that the people that they have the most conflict with are the people that they feel most intimately involved with, and the people they have the most love for.
Yeah, I mean, that was the question that struck me the most. I have to confess, I don't know any of the citations. Like, I don't recognize anything. So I've been reading very much love poetry. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about what love asks after, like what it, if we can agree that, well, in a lot of the kind of questions, there seems to be this sense that, there's nothing to be said about love and fulfillment. Like those two things don't quite go together, though love is sort of asking about or demanding reciprocity. It's not sort of about a kind of fulfillment. So then what is it aiming for, right? And yeah, I mean, I would like separate truth and fact, but think about sort of truth as something different. But there's also just like a stray comment. There's something soothing about having to answer true or false questions about love. 'Cause that's actually not how it works at all. Like you just can't. There are no multiple choice questions or answers to be filled out. Yeah.
Wendy has a comment, and we can open already into the group dialogue. That's great. Wendy, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you both so much. And I apologize in advance that I'm going to have to leave shortly after this. But Ronjaunee, you were talking about love in terms of singularity and the impossibility of replicating the kind of relational experience that one has with the other. But also, Anahid, you were talking about the kind of building a capacity for revolutionary communist love. And I wonder if that actually requires a different kind of love to be the basis for if a kind of communist love actually requires replicability and a kind of disavowal of the need for singularity, of recognition, of desire, etc., and how those two relate for you both. So thank you again.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Wendy. I mean, how do we, like, can we say that love is revolutionary just in itself? And what does someone like Budgie mean when he says, love is minimal communism? And can experiences that feel so singular, as you said, so personal, be scaled up? Like, can they speak to the collective? Can they also, I think there's a temporal dimension too. Like, can something like love point to a kind of endurance, right? Does it have a relationship to duration? Insofar as that it has a relationship to commitment and to conviction. I think it absolutely like bears a relationship to communism. And I mean, I'm always stuck on, again, that Budgie reading of love, which has to do, I think, with envisioning even a kind of minimal form, right? The one and the two, as requiring or asking that one relate to another person, not as a kind of set of parts that kind of, let's say, maintains individuality or maintains the boundaries of the self, but that involves, in fact, a kind of reorganization, right? A radical reorganization of at least two selves. So I do think about that in terms of the relationship between love and communism, but I mean, in what I wrote initially, I said love has to be kept apart from politics, because I think actually, while love can be political, while it can be revolutionary, like perhaps there's something about sort of the political sphere that demands other kinds of organizing, right? That love is maybe a part of it. But when we think about love immediately as a kind of collective or political, if we think about it under those umbrellas, we might be getting into what Freud describes in group psychology, right? Which is the love of, the love of the leader, or the father, or the master, right? Which is potentially narcissistic or mimetic. I don't know, Anahid, you've written a lot about this. So.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Anahid, I just want to add one more thing for you, because I know you wrote about the couple form as well. I'm curious to add as an addendum, which may seem unrelated to this question, but I think actually is, why it's such a struggle to imagine multiplicity in romantic love, but not, for instance, in having another kid. You know, it's like, it's so much harder to imagine adding another partner than it is to imagine adding another kid. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Something I think about.
Yeah. Those are all great questions. I mean, like, to the first part of your question, and I'm going to echo, I think, really closely what Ronjaunee said, you know, both the question of love and the question of collectivity ask how much difference we can bear, right? Like, what are the limits of something like solidarity, or a kind of structure feeling like solidarity, and how many people can it include that you actually really sort of despise, you know, on an interpersonal level, but you have solidarities with them in other dimensions. And then we can have all sorts of banal examples of that within the context of erotic love, like, you know, how much difference can you bear when you live with somebody, right? How can you handle if you're really neat and somebody else is really messy, right? And on the one hand, it seems completely trivializing to suggest that these are in any way analogous to one another, but they may actually boil down to similar kinds of psychic problems, you know. Why is it so much easier to imagine adding another child than adding another partner? I mean, you know, the easy answer is that there's structural support for having more than one child, and there are structural rewards for only having one partner. And I think that that's probably as good an answer as I could come up with. You know, this review that I wrote this week that Hannah put in the chat of Maggie Milner's couplets is, if you haven't read the book, which, you know, everyone should read, it's super interesting and very, very entertaining book, is about a woman who's in a relationship with a monogamous relationship, and she asks her partner to open the relationship only to women. So she says to her male partner that she would like to sleep with women, but that would be the limits of the open relationship. And the partner sort of says yes, and then he reneges. And she goes and sleeps with another woman anyway, and then they become involved in a relationship. But the woman that she becomes involved with is polyamorous and has multiple partners. And this becomes unbearable for the protagonist of the poem. And one of the things that I say in the review is that whatever the political dividends of polyamory are, it places extremely exacting demands on one's ego, because it's very, very hard to not be the most loved object. And so I would be, you know, I wouldn't write off how appealing it is to be, you know, fair as a star when only one is shining in the sky, to quote Wordsworth. You know, I think that that clearly has its appeal. But again, I would want to give an answer that says something more along the lines of, well, polyamory does not have a lot of structural supports within the social, and monogamy does. So that's one way, I think, to get into the question. But yeah, you know, the movement between like love of the movement that Badiou is trying to describe, that Ronjaunee has articulated so beautifully, like the movement from the one to the two to the multiple or to the collective. I think that's the problem of, you know, any talk about love within a left context. I know somebody, okay, funny story. I know somebody, actually, I know them, and then they wrote about it in a book they read, who taped that Wordsworth quotation up at their wedding, which is sort of hilarious because, I mean, one way to read that line is, you know, if you're the only person available, I would choose you, but only if you were the only person there. So it's not exactly like a passionate declaration of love. I would choose you above all others. It's, I would choose you if I could choose nobody, if I had no other option. So it always cracked me up, the idea of having that at a wedding. Yes,
well,
this is
so,
Drake.
like,
That's exactly good.
it kind of just speaks to, the ways in which so many kind of the things that you mentioned, like different kinds of, ways to organize desire, reorganize desire, like polyamory, whatever, like everything risks getting co-opted, and it in fact has, right? So
Mhm.
there's, like not only ideas about love as commodified object choice in terms of marriage and heterosexuality, but it also kind of has expanded and to include like, the multiple, to include like polyamory, like to include all of those things. And so, yeah, I mean, just because you have a kind of love that isn't sort of the couple form, that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be of the left, or it's going to be sort of transgressive. There seems to always be this sort of like ability to have it be co-opted, and this is the kind of terrible the terrible burden of our times, maybe of every time, but especially this time.
I'm also wondering, just to continue here on like a little bit specifying love or its qualities, its times, its temporalities, its histories, its aims, and still chuckling about the Wordsworth and Drake combination as well. What my smile is. Thank you, Karina. Wendy's question about what's the difference between a multiplicity of adult loves and also and having more children, I think also goes back to what Anahid was gesturing at when we think about the adult as someone deserving of care, but also just responsibility and kind of social responsibility. And then wondering if we could like linger a little bit more. The poet Juliana Spar has written about, having had many adult loves and finally not exhausting in the sense of being over it, but having had all the kinds of experiences she felt of adult friendship love, adult erotic love, and wanting a new kind. And so having a child. And so trying to just, particularize a little bit the temporalities, the structures, the levels of those people we might love the most, but also have the most conflict with.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about this question. Yeah, I mean, obviously in psychoanalysis, there are distinctions, right? And, the mother, the parent's love for the child is like a very specific, as Anahid, you pointed out in your kind of early remarks, like a very, very specific focus of psychoanalysis that maybe we might find kind of exhausted, at the moment. But yeah, I mean, like if you go back to, right, Plato or whatever, there's obviously like initially many different words for love. There's friendship, there's desire, there's also, importantly, kind of agape, there's God's love. And I think, frankly, whenever we're talking about Western culture, Christianity is haunting all accounts of love, even when we're trying to get beyond them to a kind of communism. I mean, I think that aspect of theological transcendence is very difficult to get beyond. So that's, always been there. There has never been necessarily a unified, a coherent sense of what love is. It's probably always been understood that there's radically different ways to love. And yet, I guess in the contemporary, we sort of like have compartmentalized them into these different, boxes and slides that some go together, some don't, and they happen at different times, and they have different temporalities. So we kind of fetishize romantic love, sort of like lack of endurance, it's tragedy, right? It's fleetingness, that really is a kind of major script of love. Whereas endurance is sort of less romanticized. There's less to say about it. Right. So some disparate thoughts that I have.
Thank you, Ronjaunee. Anahid, I don't know if there's anything for you here in this question, but I'd love to hear.
Yeah, no, there's so much. I mean, let's see. I was trying to think about a way to say more about my own, feeling of exhaustion around, kind of what I take to be slightly melodramatic narratives of motherhood in particular, but also childhood within psychoanalysis, and what it means to always be in, particularly in discussions of love. And Hannah, you kind of said this, I think, at the outset in your remarks, so you anticipated me in a much more complex way than I had even begun to articulate. But when psychoanalysis tries to transform through love, it also looks backwards. It looks back to moments in which there either was love, or much more often when love seemed to fail or to become unbearable in various ways when one was a child, right? Either because one had no one to love, or one had no one to love safely, and there was no one by whom one could be loved safely. And these are the, you know, the primal ruptures that occur in our childhood, and then we revisit them again and again, or some of us do revisit them again and again. But I am been thinking a lot lately about what it would mean if, just to take a completely arbitrary age, let's say that instead of always looking back to early childhood psychoanalysis, or a psychoanalyst decided to say, well, let's talk about what happened when you were 20, right? What if that, because when I think about my own personal psychic development, I think of my 20s as having been extremely significant, right? And so, and I don't want to say, I dare not say to this room, you know, more significant than my early childhood. I'm sure my early childhood was more significant, but I also think my 20s were very significant. So what would it mean to say, oh, let's take that as the baseline, or to pick a completely arbitrary moment in time, right? Let's talk about when you were 14, right? What happened then? Not because there was a major trauma then, and not because you went through puberty or whatever, but let's just take this random number. What would happen? What if our sense of the narrative of a life weren't always so weighted toward early childhood? That's just a curiosity that I have. But as for endurance and constancy, there's a beautiful moment both in the medieval writer Marjorie Kemp's autobiography, and then the example more pertinent for me in Robert Glick's wonderful, wonderful pornographic novel, Marjorie Kemp. There is a moment, which is based on Kemp's original autobiography, in which Kemp, who's been married to her husband for 30 years, says she's stopped having sex with him because she's decided that she's the bride of Christ, and so she can no longer have sexual relations with her husband. But her husband becomes old and infirm, and she takes very, very good care of him. And she says something like, I thought because we had had such joy of one another's bodies when we were young, that it was only right that I take care of his body as it was falling apart. And it's an incredibly beautiful and moving moment in the book, partly because she's created a rupture within their marital relationship. And so that they're, you know, it's no longer a marriage certainly in a medieval sense of a marriage, it's something else. But that sense, and she's now Christ's bride and not the bride of her husband, but she still feels this obligation to take care of him because they used to love fucking each other so much, you know? So that's a good example of, you know, endurance in literary history.
And thank you so much. Victor has a hand. I'll just say that I invite folks to use the hand function, or raise your actual hands. I'll look around, or use the chat, and please join the dialogue on love. Victor, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Oh, hi, I'm Victor. I was just listening to some of the things that Anne was saying, and it was really interesting. I never knew that love had so many different meanings, because from my understanding, love, I acquaint love with justice. So love and justice are one and the same. Now, when we get to being romantically involved with someone, then I would think that at some point that they would grow to love each other, because in the beginning stages, they're trying to impress each other. They're trying to show how much they care about each other. And then after a while, they grow to love each other. So I think I don't think romanticism and love are the same thing. I think it's a different thing. When someone's romantic or romanticism, I always get the idea of romanticism as someone tricking someone or trying to get someone to like them. But then when it comes to love, it's a pure thing. It's what creates things. It's what makes people be alive. It's what helps some other give birth to a child, and then the child loves the mother and the mother loves the child. And that is, to me, that's the biggest kind of love on the planet. So I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that sort of sense of love as being just, as a kind of justice. Because, you know, I think one doesn't have to say that love is just to also say it's beautiful or good, right? Like it doesn't necessarily have to be about charity or altruism to be about justice. So I think that that's interesting. And you know, the psychoanalyst Jacqueline Rose writes about love and motherhood, you know, as a kind of experience, or as in the way that literary history and philosophy has taken it up, as a kind of experience of a beginning. You know, she talks about Hannah Arendt and really the kind of radical sense of the new and of beginning again that is sort of ingrained in love's possibility in motherhood, and the way that that immediately becomes sort of like abused and exhausted by a culture that demands so much from you know, motherhood as love, right? That demands it to stand in for every social problem and contradiction. You know, that's sort of like a couple of things that you made me think about.
I could say something, but I see Alex also has a hand up, so I feel like I should let Alex speak.
I typically try to avoid talking in these events because it feels a little selfish, honestly, but I have like some scattered thoughts. I'm moved to share some scattered thoughts about what everyone has been saying. I mean, I think in psychoanalysis is interesting, I guess, because if someone's in the room with you and they're 26, 35, 42, you can ask them to associate back to their earliest childhood, but they can't. They often get like stranded and like at like 12, you know, or 13. And it takes a bit. And Freud theorizes this, of course, as a latency period where like what came before comes back later in a repetition. So in a way, they're already kind of talking about not childhood. You know, you can't, it's very hard to get back to that period of time, even however determinative and important, you know, and crucial those moments were, however much they rely on a hypothesis too, you know. And I think just speaking again, kind of in the line of like psychoanalysis and the problems in psychoanalysis, there's a couple of things that you both were saying that made me think about this too, which is that like, when it comes to like love as being in a form of endurance, as even though it might involve intensities and unrepeatable intensities, is that it's very hard in one's life to distinguish between infatuation, which is infantilizing, and the endurance of love. And it's hard to sustain that in the psychoanalytic situation too, because infatuation gets in the way of doing the work. It gets in the way of doing endurable forms of love within that practice. And of course, Freud's very clear that love is beguiling even in the psychoanalytic situation because it's not really love. Or is it love? There's an incredible ambiguity about whether or not transference love is really love or not. So these are just like scattered thoughts I have, because I just think I think they're relevant, but also they trouble me in the work of doing psychoanalysis.
The question of infatuation is so interesting. So one thing that I didn't think about it enough in an explicit way in my last book, Keats's Ode, but it's a through line through the book, and it came out in a conversation that Hannah and I did recently for Public Books. I'm very interested in the figure of the muse, who is a figure of infatuation for the poet. And in Keats's Odes, I was trying to not just inhabit the consciousness, but also represent the consciousness of Keats's muse, whose name was Fanny Braun, partly because one of the things that made his infatuation with her so maddening for him is that she didn't seem to match it in intensity, but she matched it in love. And so one thing too, to go back to the question of like how much difference is bearable, how much, to what degree are different temperatures bearable within the context of a relationship? Because some people run very hot, right? And sometimes they run very hot, very fast, and then, they cool off, or they run really hot the whole time, or they're kind of like this all the time, right? And other people are a bit more meditative and consistent, and that can sometimes appear to be coolness or neutrality or an absence of feeling, or perhaps, in a certain register as a kind of manipulativeness. And Fanny Braun was often described as being a coquette, somebody who's not really committed. But so I'm interested, for all sorts of reasons, but personal and intellectual, in the notion of that kind of coolness as, in fact, a form of intensity. And indeed as a kind of affect management. Some people, when they feel very intensely about something, present as very cool about it. So, I think it's important to remember, and this sort of goes back to something that I wanted to say in response to Victor, and it's something that my teacher, Lauren Berlant, would always say, and it's something that Lauren got from Eve Sedgwick, namely, people are different, I think it's it's the great lesson of queer theory, but it's the great lesson of psychoanalysis, right? People are different from each other. And so some people need infatuation, they need that startup energy. Some people are, as they say about children, slow to warm. Some people are always slow to warm. I remember when my daughter was in preschool and we had, parent teacher conference or whatever, and the preschool teacher said in this sort of stern way, she's slow to warm, which is actually a technical term that people use for certain types of personalities in children. There are some children who attach very quickly, and there are children who are slow to warm. And when the teacher said that, she said it in a slightly critical way. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, you mean like all the best people? Surely all the best people are slow to warm, but that's my own bias. But yeah, I think it's probably important to have in any conversation about love on the table, the notion that people are different.
Yeah, and I mean, also just, Alex, you just maybe think about the ways that it's almost impossible to separate endurance from just succumbing to certain pre-existing scripts for how to be. And I think that's the difficulty, right? Is what you're testifying to the endurance of love, or just simply, letting time pass in a particular form that is not unbearable or intolerable, or what have you. And I don't think I don't think psychoanalysis answers the question, and that this is, I guess that's an opening for other kinds of ways of thinking and being to come in. But yeah, I think like this whole conversation manifests like a little bit of a friction or a tension within psychoanalysis around sort of trying to approach this term, right? This notion of love. And I certainly feel that way.
I wanted to say something about what Anne was saying. I don't know, sometimes when teachers, I think a lot of teachers mean well when they make comments about your kid, about warm, but could it be that it just be that she's not interested, she's not ready, and that's okay. So I don't know, I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, I wish I had it in front, because I remember looking it up, because there's like a gradation, one is like, it's not quick to warm, but whatever, it was like there's 1, 2, and 3, and whatever the 1 is, it means a child who runs into a new situation with a great deal of exuberance. 2 is slow to warm, which means exactly as you said, more cautious, right, and more circumspect. And then 3 was now zoning into a kind of pathology, i.e. a child that cannot bond at all, right? And I sort of wanted to say that also, I didn't have a coherent thought about it, but when Alex, you were saying quite rightly, nobody really remembers their early childhood. We think we do, or there are stories that have been told to us so many times that we even have sense memories of them, right? Even though there's no true way that we could possibly remember them. I also have, been struck by the fact that when I talk to friends of mine who have had very, very significant childhood trauma, that they will often say they remember nothing of their childhood, and they'll say that outright, Whereas I will say, I remember this, I remember this, I remember this, I remember this. And so I also wonder, that made me think, when you said that, that made me think, to what degree trauma influences our desire to have a narrative about our childhood, or a desire to remember our childhood. Because I think I can remember terrible things that happened when I was little, but my desire to remember my childhood probably comes from a place of basically a baseline of warmth and good feeling, you know? But so, yeah, it's something I've noticed. I've heard so many friends of mine say, oh, I don't remember anything. That's so funny that you remember being 7. That's so fun, you know, how odd, because I don't remember anything before I was 12.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited by this like potential recuperation of slow to warm, because that definitely, that probably describes me in my childhood, and also still a lot of ways that I approach,
Yeah.
you know, certain love objects, including books, like including texts and things.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that's interesting.
There are a number of really great questions in the chat, and I was wondering if I could read the 3 of them together and see what comes up. Just because, yeah, the chat's been amazing. So thank you for everyone who's participating in it. From Sebastian, I think really following on this idea that you're bringing up, Ronjaunee, about the sort of haunting of Christian love, what could be a way to approach love as something that opens to the multiple, that tarries with the incommensurable, that doesn't collapse into a Christian love of thy anonymous neighbor? What room is there for the qualities of the loved other without collapsing love into a calculation? Question 1. Question 2 is from Frederick. Is there a transcultural dimension to love? Is Black working class love different from white bourgeois love? Pick your variables, but variables as well. And then Clemency Wells, love as endurance. Do you think that form of, as a form of work, or love requiring work, came about recently, or has that always appeared in the literature? Maybe we could take those 3. So a kind of historical question, transcultural question, and a kind of futural speculative question about a good kind of maybe revolutionary love.
Yeah, these are great questions. I might have something, well, I want to speak to Fred's question. Not that I have necessarily any neat answers, but it is something that's like, you know, I've thought about, because a lot of my thinking about love too, like writing this essay, had to do with, you know, reading on decolonial love, and thinking about, you know, what does it mean to kind of like, what does it mean when writers like Leanne Simpson write about loving outside of the kind of strictures of colonial violence and history? And like, I would say that, again, I'm not someone who, you know, is into kind of universalism, but I do believe that certain things are universal, and that love is, you know, one of those things. But I also, you know, I think about something Nancy says, that there is no master figure for love. And I think that's important when we're trying to consider, you know, the existence, the endurance, the importance of love, outside of these white bourgeois and also Christian models, right? Yeah, I mean, you know, I wrote a little bit about how, you know, in Klein, the kind of relationship between love and reparation, in the way that she's written about it, leads her to kind of slip into writing about sort of the social as a kind of colonial community, in which kind of love ends up sort of making up for violence, and that there's, you know, something deeply troubling about that, and that we need to always sort of kind of keep separate love and an intensely recuperative kind of dimension, because, you know, that is perhaps what gets us then back to the nuclear family, whiteness, property, you know, a kind of tyrannical or transcendental God, and you know, so there's probably a lot more to say about that, but yeah, that's kind of what I had to note about that question. Anahid, do you want to speak?
Yeah, I was getting distracted by the chat, but also I feel like this is sort of like a cheating response, because Fred and I taught a class together on Blake and Baraka a couple of years ago, and in that class we read Gwendolyn Brooks's Riot. Gwendolyn Brooks is one of the people whose poetry is was quoted at the end of my presentation. I didn't quote from Riot; it's a different poem of Brooks's, but those of you who know the poem Riot, and this goes back to what Wendy was asking about in the beginning of the conversation as well, the poem is divided into a couple of parts, and the last section, and so there's been, in the first part of the poem, I mean, it does what it says on the tin. It describes a riot in Chicago following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And, you know, people are killed, I mean, various things happen. The last section of the poem is in Obad, and it's this kind of post-love scene between two people who are saying goodbye to one another, presumably after having made love all night. They're now going their separate ways down, Brooks says, the imperturbable street. And it's a very fascinating, very beautiful, and very challenging end to that poem, because having, you know, exposed us to these, you know, scene after scene of revolutionary collectivity, we end with two people, right? We end with two people in a room saying goodbye to one another down the imperturbable street. Well, why is the street imperturbable if we've just had 3 days of rioting? You know, and this goes to what Ronjaunee was saying about the ways in which anything can be co-opted or recuperated. You know, something, you know, sometimes there's revolutionary violence and then it seems like everything goes back to business as usual, you know, the next day. And is love part of that business as usual? Or is that love scene that ends that poem between two people, you know, is it actually meant to show you that in the midst of riot, in the midst of insurrection, you need to have these moments of intimacy and tenderness, because that is partly what the revolution is for, right? To emancipate us as sexual erotic beings. So that's where I wanted to go, partly just because, you know, Fred, every time I see you on Zoom, I think, remember when we taught that class and it was great. But yeah, so that's a poem that I would think about partly in relation to the question of the transcultural and, you know, what does and does not carry over from one culture to another. I'm sort of with Ronjaunee. I think I do believe, without being a universalist, that like some experiences are probably pretty universal. I think that I would get behind that horse. And then what were some of those other questions?
Well, there's a question about love as work that I think is worth talking about. Let me see.
I mean, I hate to go quote Wordsworth again, and I hate to keep bringing everything back to poetry, but there's a line in a poem by Wordsworth where Wordsworth is describing a parent whose name is Michael. Michael is basically the claim is that through basically that I can't remember exactly what the beginning of the line is, but basically the claim is that because he has to rock his child's cradle, because he has no choice but to rock his child's cradle when the baby cries, Michael begins to love his child. It's something like through acts of patient mind enforced to tenderness or something like that. But the claim is that you are enforced to tenderness for a child, and that love is work. And in fact, that work precedes love. It's only because you've been doing this work of care, because you had no choice to do it, that you actually then begin to love an infant. That's not my own experience. You know, again, people are different, but so that, you know, that's a poem from around 1800. And I don't know if that is a good answer to the question of whether or not this idea of love as work is new. I think partly that question is hard to answer because our ideas about work have changed so dramatically since around the year 1800. So it would make sense to me, as a person who specializes in the literature and history of that period, to say the very swift attachment of work and love is not coincidental to the rise of industrial capitalism and the breakdown of a more agrarian society in England. And I'm not really equipped to say, I mean, it's certainly true that love has always been associated with suffering, but whether or not that's the same thing as associating love with work, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I do think you're right to point out that actually the disaggregation of love and work is very much the sleight of hand of capital, and that's what we see in all these kinds of, at least British literary texts like post 1800, and the marriage plot and et cetera,
Yeah.
love purely, a kind of personal kind of, relationship of identity, a personal emotion, one that doesn't have to do, actually, it's not shaped by a political or kind of context in common, or that involves love. And so I think it's actually interesting to think about bringing work back into the thinking of love, understanding it as being preceded by the work of care, even having a kind of rhythm, or, I mean, again, and Black feminist theory talks a lot about love as a kind of praxis, right? So I think those two terms like really bear some relationship to one another, And again, going back to psychoanalysis, it is like transference is a work, So one wonders too if that's like, that's part of it. That's part of it too. Just looking at the other questions.
I wanted to say that I've never heard of this term love as work, because always that when you love someone or some folks or a group or whatever, it's not something that you have to labor. Like when I heard the example of the man rocking the baby in the cradle, he's not doing it because it's work. He's doing it because it's soothing to the infant, to the child, and he's playing a role as him as a father, whether it be a lady playing the role as a woman. So I find it difficult to understand why that would be work.
It is true that you've reminded me now, and I should just look it up, that in that poem, the description of rocking the cradle of the child is described as Michael, the father, doing woman's service. So it's a kind of theorization of parenthood as being forced to be a mother and having no choice, but to do the action of a mother or do the action of a woman because the baby is crying and you would like the baby to stop crying, and so there's something about it that I think unsettles us, because we want to think of parental love, and we want to think, I think, of all kinds of love as spontaneous. There's a kind of spontaneous desire to give, to care for, to soothe, but it's not always true. Sometimes there is effort involved, and sometimes there is a kind of misery to that labor. It's not pleasant. And so somebody said in the chat, now there's all this language in therapy of like doing the work and have people done the work. It's really fascinating. Somebody should write, maybe people have, but like somebody should write about that, because I always find that language sort of deeply disturbing in various ways. But yeah, I mean, also one thing that's funny about transference is that like the analyst is literally at work, right? they're at work. That's their job. They're doing their job. They're being paid for it. It's like their billable 50 minutes, right? But the whatever you want to call it, analysis. I'm old school, so I still say patient. That person is not at work, although they may be doing the work. And so there's two very, very different ideas of what labor is in that scenario. And then that may also want to inform our notion of how we think about transference too.
There's this, there's the ethical standard in the US for the last 45, 50 years, where that's been codified now in that time, where the analyst will say of a patient, once a patient, always a patient, because once a child, always a child. And so the kind of maternal paternal labor and the analytic labor, this is for, of course, I should say, like to prevent analysts and patients from sleeping with one another, right, and doing boundary violation on either side, but particularly the analyst side of the dyad. And so that kind of conflation of those two kinds of work, one which is remunerated and one which is not, and kind of fascinating as they rub up against each other. Okay, Well, I'm seeing already applause. So perhaps now is a good time to ask everyone to join me in thanking Ronjaunee and Anahid for joining us on their Saturdays. And thank you all for joining us on your Saturday. It's been such a pleasure. I have so many small notations of true and false and no poems. So perhaps I could ask Anahid for the bibliography as requested. and
Yes,
even a copy
I
of
will give you the bibliography.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.